In part two of this week's lecture on culture, we're going to look at norms and values. Those are two of the five components of non-material culture that we identified in the first section of this week's lecture. And we're also going to spend a little bit of time talking about how cultures change. One of the things when we talk about norms and values, of course, is we need to define what a norm is. And a norm is an expectation or a rule for our behavior. And there are both informal and formal norms. And an example of that might be, for instance, one formal norm would be the expectation that, that I was going to say that we sleep at night and we're up in the day, but and for the most part that's true, I suppose, and I'll just continue to use that. I realize that many people now work night shifts and that's not the case, but for the average American citizen, we sleep at night, we're up and moving about and being productive in the daytime. That's kind of a formal norm. Perhaps you go to school. That's a formal norm. You're required to be educated, although you can also have that done at home. You don't have to actually go to a building, but you have to go through the instructional lessons. Informal norms might include things like you open the door for a person behind you, or you hold the door open until that person behind you gets the door. You move to the right when you're about to bump into somebody coming in the opposite direction to you. And there's another example of formal norms. In many countries, we drive on the right. In this country, in this nation, and I think in most nations around the world, and yet in some nations, they drive on the left. That's certainly a formal norm. That's not informal. But walking in the left and the right would be considered more informal. Norms will change as cultures change. An example being, again, of course, what side of the road you drive on is a good example of that. But there's also other, perhaps more meaningful kinds of norms about behaviors that change from culture to culture as well. Now, a sanction is the reaction that others around us would have to the breaking of those norms, and there are both positive and negative sanctions. In plain English, positive sanctions tend to be rewards, negative sanctions tend to be punishments. When we talk about norms, really you can break norms behavior down into three types of behaviors, or three types of norms, let's say. And again, remember, these are sort of the prescriptions we have for our behaviors when you live in a society, how you're expected to behave and act, and maybe even think. And this first is folkways, and a folkway is a norm that is not strictly enforced. An example of a folkway would be an individual. Let's say there is, let's say men walking around without a shirt on in downtown in a southern city in the summertime. You know, the man's just walking down the street with a pair of shorts on and sandals. It's a hot day. It's kind of muggy, and while typically speaking, most men will have a shirt on. When they're in public, there are those who will walk down the street without a shirt on, and no one really kind of thinks twice about it. Well, it depends on how the guy looks, I suppose, without the shirt, maybe, but it's kind of accepted. Nobody does anything about it. Nobody's blowing whistles or pointing or calling the police or anything like that. Now, so that's a folkway. A moray is a norm that, when broken, goes against society's basic core values. A woman walking down a street without a shirt on in this culture, in American culture, would be a violation of a moray, because, there actually could be legal consequences to this, for that matter. So that goes against the society's basic core values, which is we tend to see breasts as sexual organs, in female breasts, not male breasts, but female breasts, and so we have this belief in society that we should keep our sexual organs covered at all times, unless we're in intimate circumstances. And so this is an example of a moray, a similar behavior, but it's viewed very differently in the society. A taboo is a norm, when broken, that is not only is a violation of core values in society, but it's really considered repulsive. And two behaviors that are pretty easily identified as taboo in almost all cultures are cannibalism and incest. The sexual behavior among very, very close relatives. Those are generally considered taboo, and when you hear stories about people eating people, or you hear stories about brothers and sisters having sexual relations in America, or a father having sex with his daughter, or something like that, it tends to, for the typical American, evoke a very strong negative reaction, and that kind of helps define the difference between a moray and a taboo. Now, as you go up this chain, let's say, of behaviors or whatever, as you progress along this chain, the sanctions against those behaviors tend to become more severe, sometimes more formalized. So a violation of Folkway, generally there isn't a sanction. And it's kind of interesting, you can look at the issue of nudity, for instance, as an example here in each of these three categories. Let's say Folkways. Every now and then you hear about somebody streaking somewhere, and streaking is, just running nude through a public area in front of people, and I don't know, I haven't heard a whole lot about streaking lately, but during the Vietnam War, for instance, there was a lot of tension, a lot of anxiety, a lot of frustration, and a certain sense of alienation, among young people in particular, towards a larger society. And so sometimes some of these outrageous kind of behaviors occurred I think, to kind of relieve some of that tension and to express it. And so it seemed as though streaking was a little more frequent in those days. And I can remember sitting in my dorm cafeteria and, once or twice, some guy running through. Generally, he'd have a mask on so that people didn't know who he was, but would go run through the dorm cafeteria. Usually it was males without any clothes on, just streak through the cafeteria, and that was it. Everybody would laugh. People would wonder, who was it? And probably the dorm manager took him aside when they figured out who it was and wagged her finger at him. But he didn't get kicked out of school. He didn't get kicked out of the dorm, or anything like that. That's while public nudity is against the law, in a certain situation, it was accepted and even considered humorous. Now, if you're sitting in the classroom in your university, and some guy, that same guy, let's say, just goes sauntering down the hallway, totally nude, past the classroom, past every door in the hallway, that's a whole different thing. And likely you're going to see him being hauled off by law enforcement and perhaps taken to a hospital for psychiatric assessment or something like that. It really, in that setting, in that situation, that behavior really violates a moray at that point, where there's a certain expectation about how you would behave in a university setting, for instance. Now, let's say this individual goes on to pose for photographs nude for a pornographic magazine. That may not quite go as far as a taboo, but depending upon the nature of the photograph, for instance, that nude guy may seem to be very repulsive, and the photographs that he poses for may seem repulsive. And so this is an example of, I think, the differences in how we view even one similar behavior, and it also helps to define a little bit of the difference between folkways, mores, and norms, taboos rather. I mean, there's some other folkways that are less striking. For instance, again, I think a folkway is, hold the door for somebody behind you. You get no punishment if you let the door slam in somebody's face, but it's just considered to be the right thing to do. When I was younger, men were expected to open the door for women. That is less the case now because of gender equality. But many of us still have that habit, and sometimes we get chewed out about it, because we're treating women as though they're not capable of holding the door themselves, So again, cultures change over time as well. So here's an example of teaching gender behavior. Speaking of which, from the Dick and Jane readers, and most of us had the Dick and Jane readers when we were in elementary school, I believe, and Actually, Sally was the little sister. That's right. I forgot about Sally. But, this is how, maybe this isn't the same thing that the youth of America have been raised on, but these are the kinds of things that the older generation in America was raised on. These are our readers. And this is where we learn to read with Dick and Jane. But you also see that in the course of teaching us to read, we are also teaching gendered behaviors, father-son, mother-daughter behaviors, and what's appropriate for each gender. Now, based on this book, what kind of norm do you think Dick might be violating if he helped his mom sew, or if Jane wanted to help slop the pigs? What kind of sanction might they receive if they violated those gender norms? And today, probably not so much. I think probably they'd be more concerned about Dick asking to learn to sew than about Jane asking to learn to slop the hogs. But there are different reasons for that doesn't have so much to do with gender, I think, as it has to do with homophobia among males. But nonetheless, the norms about household chores are changing also as time goes along. Again, these are the kinds of things, and perhaps the difference between the response to Jane and the response to Dick kind of crossing gender lines there has also to do with some of those cultural values that I was talking about. That's kind of deeply ingrained kinds of things about the place of men and women. Whereas the feminist movement has taught us to see that women can do all sorts of different kinds of things that we used to think they shouldn't or couldn't do. We still have that underlying belief that men should not do feminine things, that anti-feminine aspect, and so that could reflect some of that cultural stuff that I was talking about earlier that's so deeply ingrained in us. Two aspects of cultures are subcultures and countercultures, and these are really their own little worlds, little or large, depending upon the particular subculture or counterculture within the dominant culture. And the difference is how their norms and values fit with the values of the dominant culture. And with a subculture, the norms and values do not clash with the dominant culture, but in a counterculture, they do. An example of a subculture would be if you've traveled to New York City, for instance, you might have the pleasure of dining in Little Italy. And in fact, a couple of trips that I've made to New York City, when we were in Little Italy, there was actually a street celebration going on, sort of a carnival of sorts, and with all sorts of booths and ethnic foods and games and things like that going on. It was really quite an event, actually. Or Chinatowns in any of the major cities as well. There are cultural groups, individuals from certain ethnic groups cluster together in a larger community, and the reason for that in part is certainly to help their culture survive, but also to provide mutual support and assistance, because they have more understanding among individuals who have come from their culture than they would from individuals in the larger English world. Now, those cultures exist within the city and don't clash with the city, generally speaking, and there's a perfectly acceptable mix between the members of the larger city and the subcultures and those kinds of things. But there is definitely its own subculture in existence in those locations, and so it isn't just about the restaurants, and so that's a good example of a subculture. A counterculture, the values clash with the dominant culture, and from my own experience, the best example of that is probably the hippie movement of the 1960s, where the young people in that movement really kind of dropped out of society. Those who are really deeply into the hippie culture, really lived in communes and moved up and down. Really didn't even associate so much with one particular area. They may move from time to time to different areas. Rejected the materialism of American culture. Rejected, they refused to register for the draft, perhaps. And children were having babies and not wanting to, register their births. I know of one young man that whose birth registration was delayed because of that. This is a counterculture, kind of rejecting, and it is a clash. In fact, the woman who didn't register her son got into some trouble for doing that, his birth, and that demonstrates some of the clash in those with the dominant culture. And so that's a counterculture. It's the values don't mix at all. Now, um, take for instance gangs, let's say inner city gangs. Would you call them subcultures or countercultures? Because you really what we see is behaviors that for the individuals in a larger culture are hard to understand. That seem criminal in nature. That are kind of frightening to members of the larger culture, perhaps, and everything. And in that respect, seem like a counterculture, and yet, by and large, individuals in inner city gangs have the same values, expectations of life that we have in material America. They want riches like Americans want. They want to have nice cars and good homes and those kinds of things. But they're resorting to behaviors that are at odds with the larger society. And again, when we talk about race and ethnicity, and also when we talk about deviance, we're going to talk a little bit more about the reasons for that. But it has to do with the fact that their access to the means to success are blocked in traditional ways, and so they have to find their own ways to become successful and to define success. They want success like everyone does in America, but they go about it in different ways. So in that respect, you're really looking at subcultures, inner city gangs as subcultures, not as countercultures. Now, when we talk about values, there are many different things, from culture to culture that can be considered values. But particularly to the United States, here's an example of some of the things that we considered values in American. In many respects, our behaviors, our expectations of our children, or children's expectations of their parents connect to these values, these beliefs, such things as individualism and freedom, education, religiosity, love, science, equality. These are all values that our author identifies as dominant values. There are 15 of them here for American society today. From culture to culture, society to society around the world, these values may or may not apply in other places. To us, this is the foundation of what everything is good and right. This is what our life is oriented around. So when you move to another culture where these values aren't considered so important, or maybe even seen as negative, you feel, well, that's what some of the things that bring about culture shock, in fact. You feel very much out of place. But that does not make other cultures less, less than us, less than ours. It doesn't make other cultures not as good as ours. I teach another course frequently called the Introduction to Social Welfare in America, and the author of the textbook in that course, Phyllis Day, actually is a feminist author who writes about the 9 American values very early in her textbook. And what we do throughout the semester in that course, among other things, is to take a look at how these values impact our judgments about people who receive public assistance and who are needy. And the 9 American values here that you can see are not unlike the 15 values that Henslin has in his text. Egalitarianism and individualism, this is that sense that, we're all equal, and so we should all be able to work hard and be successful just like anyone else. Judeo-Christian charity, which implies this is again what she believes are basic American values, that all of us hold these values, that when someone needs help, they should get help. They deserve help. The Protestant work ethic, which implies that everyone should work, that work is not only necessary but moral. Social Darwinism, which is sort of a variation on Darwin's theory about the survival of the fittest, and in this respect it says that individuals who aren't making it as a society really don't have the don't deserve any assistance or help in order to get that if they don't do well, we should just kind of let them fend for themselves. It's not a value that, by the way, that we all, I believe in social Darwinism. We're not like that, but Phyllis Day says that's one of those things that's ingrained in our makeup, in our being. Puritan morality, this sense that we should be true to our partner in a marriage, that we should not be sexually promiscuous, that we shouldn't gamble, that we shouldn't drink, that we should always respect other people, those kinds of things. Patriarchy, men are primary. Men have privilege that women don't have. Men do things that women don't do. White privilege, likewise, because we're Caucasian, or because some of us are Caucasian, I should say, just by being Caucasian, we can assume certain things about our lives and our culture that gives us a leg up in culture. Marriage and family, that the natural state of things is for a man to marry a woman and have children. And finally, the white Anglo-Saxon American ideal, which is that to be tall, dark, and handsome, or blonde and buxom, I think, for women, or maybe today that's changing to thin, but in any event, certain kinds of things, youthful, white, middle class, these kinds of things, that's a part of that ideal. And that if you're different from this, then somehow you don't quite measure up. And so these are days, what she believes, that are in the core of Americans. Now, for those individuals, and I know I'm speaking to some of those individuals when I say this, those individuals who are of other ethnic backgrounds, who are born American, some of these values would likely be very conflictual for you. And the question would be, as an American, do you sign on to these values? Do you believe in these values, these things that make Americans Americans, Phyllis Day says? And she's not saying this positively, mind you. She's just saying this is the way it is. Or do you refuse to adopt certain of these values, and in doing so then separate yourself from the dominant culture some? And a good example of that would be the white Anglo-Saxon American ideal, of course. For individuals, for instance, who are gay or lesbian, the marriage and family ideal has been a particular problem for them because of the fact that society has not allowed you to marry, not allowed you to adopt children, or if you are allowed, there's a great deal of scrutiny. White privilege for those that are of different racial backgrounds, etc., etc., patriarchy in women. So these are the kinds of things, nonetheless, Phyllis Day says are American values. And some of the conflicts that I'm asking you about there with these values are the things that we talk about in Social Work Human Services 106. That's Introduction to Social Welfare. So we have all these different values, and we have clusters and contradictions in these values. We have values that are very similar to each other that we hold, and we have contradictions in some of our values. And again, an example of contradictory values in Phyllis Day's 9 values might be the idea of Judeo-Christian charity, which says, when somebody needs something, we should help them, versus egalitarianism and individualism, which says that, take care of yourself. And the work ethic, which says, if you're not working, you're lazy and you're immoral. These are good examples of value contradictions within our own set of values that are ingrained in Americans. Henslin talks about values that are emerging in the newer generations and in the newer age, and this includes the value of leisure. And this is not to say that Henslin and the rest of us in the older generation think younger people are lazy, but it does say that with the advances in technology, it is no longer necessary to work as much for many people, I will add, as it once was. And so the accumulation of leisure, the opportunity actually to have more leisure, actually is becoming a sign of success. The less you work, the more you travel, the more you have vacations, the more you can relax. It's becoming more the sign of success even than the amount of money that you have anymore. It depends on how much money I guess you have, but nonetheless, leisure is one value. Self-fulfillment has certainly become an emerging value. This is that sense that what's most important in life is to make sure that we live up to our full potential and that we gain the kinds of things that we want for ourselves. Physical fitness, an emerging value. Youthfulness. There's an increasing emphasis upon the youth and the beauty of youth and the wonders of youth. And concern for the environment is another emerging value that has been developing over the last few decades. And so with all these values, we wonder sometimes why it is then our culture doesn't actually reflect all those values, sometimes the reality of life. And this is the difference between the ideal culture, which are those values, norms, and goals that we consider to be ideal and worth aiming for, versus the real culture, the values and norms that people actually follow. So ideal versus real culture often don't mesh, often don't match. We talk about culture change. Technology is one of the means that cultures change. If you remember when we were talking about social movements and social change, technology was a tool that leads towards social change. And so when we talk about technology, that's what we're really talking about. Tools, and generally this is a material culture aspect, but really what we find is that as the material culture changes, also as technology changes, I should say, culture will follow, generally speaking. Although when culture doesn't follow, that refers back to what we were talking about as cultural lag. So technology may change the material culture, and that sets the framework for the group's non-material culture to follow and change behind it. I would say an example, again, the computer chip is just something that's real at hand, and everybody understands the changes, that there are changes going on. Even those of you born after the introduction of the computer chip, understand that it is really altering life rapidly, because change is going on around us on a day-to-day basis, and the non-material culture is changing behind the reality of the material changes that go on. An example, and this might be a bit of a stretch, but in education, for instance, where we value interaction between instructor and student and on a face-to-face basis, and yet with the increasing access of education online, such as this class, oftentimes now instructors and students aren't meeting each other, and what was once considered to be a very critical and key element in education, perhaps that teacher-student interaction, isn't happening on a face-to-face basis now, and we're finding that interaction in emails and discussion boards and blogs and all those kinds of tools that we use is an acceptable alternative. Well, is it really or not? This is something for you to judge, and for me to judge, I think, as an instructor as well. Other important aspects, things about our definitions of intimacy, for instance, and is another example of a non-material culture, and things that are going to change with the availability of online contacting between people. Now, I'm going to go to the middle first. Why these things are happening so quickly is because of what we were just talking about. I believe it has to do with the computer chip and the fact that communication has become instantaneous, not almost instantaneous. It's become instantaneous now. Cultural diffusion describes how a cultural characteristic is spread from one culture to another. And cultural leveling is one of those things that happens because of cultural diffusion, and that is that eventually cultures become similar to each other. Now, an example, you see here a picture of an older Asian individual, and when you first glance at this picture, you think he might be meditating, and then you realize he's got a laptop in his hands. And so you see here the blending of Eastern and Western cultures in this photograph. And as I look at this picture, I think about the fact that I learned to meditate. It's an Eastern practice. Meditation may be used in Western society for different reasons than it is valued in Eastern society. In Western society, it's considered a form of relaxation. Some people really do see it as consciousness raising, and those other kinds of things that certainly Eastern values are associated with that. But there's an Eastern behavior that has moved to the West, and likewise, acupuncture, an Eastern medical practice that is now being practiced in the West in many places. However, Western culture seems to be more dominant and is certainly moving to the east. And an example, perhaps, is the communist society in China that still is very Western in its economics. That really uses a capitalistic system, even though the political system continues to be very communistic. And so there's an example of Western culture and Western practices diffusing to the east. And the author says essentially that most cultural diffusion goes from west to east and not the other way around. Whether that's good or not, well, I suppose it depends if you're Western or Eastern in nature, but from an objective standpoint, it's probably something we'll learn over the course of generations. And so this slide asks you to consider the kinds of hobbies and norms that you've adopted from other cultures that really aren't American, but nonetheless that you've taken up and practiced yourself. One final slide I want to mention before we quit, and this week you're reading the article Body Ritual Among the Nakarema by Horace Minor. The Nakarema Society advanced ideas about how to care for the body to an extraordinary degree, according to Henslin's reader, rather. And they even talk about child rearing, involves teaching the young how to follow through with these rituals and things like this. And so I just want to tell you that as you read this article, keep in mind that there's a mystery, a secret that's buried in the article, and not everybody gets it. And I want to ask you, if you get it, don't announce it in your discussion boards, please. But write to me about it in an email. Tell me that you got it in an email, and if you do, I'll add 5 points to your whatever discussion board grade you're going to get for this discussion board. I'll add a 5-point bonus for those people who get this mystery and who email me by next Sunday afternoon. Actually, just make it next Sunday night when that is when the discussion board post should be in. So 5 extra bonus points if you get the mystery or you figure out the secret and you write to me about it at my home email address. Just a little fun for you. Be on a treasure hunt. And so that's all for this week, and I hope that this lecture helped you understand the concept of culture and how it fits into other parts of this course that we have covered and we will be covering over the next few weeks. If there's any questions lingering, as always, please contact me and let me know. Thank you.